This is an addendum to my last recording when I was talking about sort of hypergamous cultural norms or a culture that is run by sort of the hypergamous sentiment or that they have the reins of cultural conventions that are then being promulgated in such a way so as to assist um, the kind of the hypergamous sexual strategy for success. Or you could also call it a sort of a female dominated or a female centric, sort of culture in that sense, in as much as the sexual mating strategies are distinct between the sexes, over some kind of, large scale generalization. Okay, so there's this video, which I just watched by the YouTube channel is Mr. Sweet, two words, Mr. Sweet, Mister, and he, oh wow, he's only got like 7,000 subscribers, so that's interesting. But this video has gotten like over 450,000 views, so that's pretty impressive. Anyway, the title of the video is "Why is Gen Z humor so weird?" And I don't want to rehash everything that he brings up. I think it's a brilliant video. I'll try and put the link in it to it in the description of this video. But I think that the reason why I bring it up is because it corresponds to what I was just talking about in terms of the hypergamous thing. But so he talks about humor and he talks about the standards of humor in Gen Z and how they are basically. I would say that the overarching theme in everything that he brings up is that the humor of Gen Z is antithetical to coherence. It tends towards some kind of lowest common denominator of sort of mediocrity, but also sort of undecipherability in some sense, that it's all a kind of political virtue signal. Although perhaps I should just ex- uh, sort of substantiate that point. What I mean to say is that humor has been colonized in Generation Z to be a kind of politically dictated, a universal sort of lowest common denominator standard. And in some sense, people have given up their own sense of humor. They've given up their own sensibility in terms of humor so as to become sort of the uh, sort of the floating debris in the zeitgeist, to be, sort of corralled on the right side of history, because, to follow the, to not, to not be the odd one out, to not stick, so I do feel like Gen Z, and probably for exactly the reasons, or practically for exactly the same reasons that Mr. Sweet was talking about, sort of the oversaturation effect of the internet and sort of social media, or at least terms of how things are popular and how they are sort of promoted and advertised by sort of the ability of the internet to sort of broaden the scope of people's access to what other people are doing, and that having a kind of cultural amplification. And in the face of that, Gen Z has not developed the necessary temerity to guard their own private view or their own personal perspective on things. They have relegated that and outsourced it to, let's say, like the cultural groupthink, because it has delivered them sort of more. I can't think of the word. I think Eric Weinstein probably has a word for this. You know, sort of something relating to the rate of innovation and the rate of, sort of seemingly being able to, as a cultural mechanism, sort of very safely provide uh, novelty, and so sort of. almost the evolutionary meme of novelty in this, as a kind of hyperstimulus, as a kind of psychological hyperstimulus, has created a kind of so I'm mixing some words together here, but a kind of process addiction on a kind of being a denizen of a cultural landscape that one, you see, like, in my view, when one was a teenager, the whole point of being a teenager somewhat, and which often involved developing subculture, was so that one could somewhat be a larger fish in a small pool. You moved into a subculture because then you had the ability to control the lens through which that you framed society, and that you could digest and understand it from your own understanding. That in some sense this was a feature of somewhat of the general liberal cultural framework, that one could explore one's own subculture, and one could self-define one's own subculture. This was, in some sense, this has been replaced by somewhat probably identity politics, which is obviously a much more soulless and a much more psychologically harmful way of interfacing with these kinds of issues, because in some sense you don't locate your own identity, you essentially you subscribe to it, so you discover how the world treats your identity. It's very sort of, there's an external locus of control that's sort of intrinsically embedded in that. The same kind of sort of external locus of control as the internet delivering to you your daily dose of novelty, and you have to keep up with that novelty or something like that, because you haven't sort of, again, developed the temerity of disconnecting from novelty in order to endorse your own internal authenticity, or your own, which in some sense is going to not measure up well against the agglomerated sophistication of a decentralized network. But if you understand that the decentralized sort of aggregation function of the internet or social media or whatever you want to call it, is going to be fundamentally impersonal. It's going to be fundamentally untethered. It's going to be fundamentally, well, I mean, the biggest aggravating issue here is that it's not coherent. It's not coherent. It doesn't have a kind of self-consistency or an, well, I mean, it does end up, okay, it does have a kind of self-consistency, but it's a self-consistency that is predicated on a kind of collectivist framework of reality and experience and history, and because essentially it has to, so you are experiencing culture via the lens of a narrative, not via the lens of a personal individual that has any kind of, that has an individual self-consistency. So you're getting a model of self-consistency that's literally based in a groupthink, displacing, so you've got a narrative and an external locus of control displacing any kind of individual authenticity. And this, I would argue, is why Gen Z is so psychologically disturbed and fragile, and it's interesting because in this video, why Gen Z humor is so weird, he points this out, the kind of the mental health problems and the depression, and you can actually hear the guy screaming in the background like nothing. I can't remember exactly what he says, but he's basically complaining that nothing has any merit, that nothing has any sort of value to him. It's all sort of disconnected from him. He literally complains, is this guy sort of, I think he's sort of shouting from a bathtub. I think he's, I can't remember, maybe I was not looking at the picture properly. I was just listening to it more than I was watching, but I think, he was sort of fully clothed in a bathtub with his head between his knees, sort of shouting, I just want to feel something, or I just, or something should have some kind of significance. And so that's my general sort of reading of the whole of Generation Z. And that's because they have relegated things like humor to an external narrative. They have made themselves subjugate to a political dictate, or a political dispensation of culture that is fundamentally negotiated on the level of the collective. They are not individuals that make up a culture, they are the consumers of a culture. They are not creators, they are consumers. And in this sense, they have fully given up any kind of liberal libertarian sensibility, and therefore also the kind of the coherence and the internal authenticity that would be provided by operating as such a as such an actor, as such a cultural, and because essentially, this is how I see it, because you have to imagine how this produces itself in practice, is that at some point the 8-year-olds or the 9-year-olds at school are talking about things, and all the things that they're talking about come from the internet, they come from the collective narrative, something like that. And at some point someone has to be able to develop a view in which they go against the grain, in which they criticize, in which they say, I'm getting off the train. I'm I'm going to, sort of seemingly develop my own subculture. I'm going to seemingly craft my own reality bubble. And I'm going to police it. I'm going to filter it and say what is allowed to be in the bubble and what isn't allowed to be in the bubble. What is allowed to come into the bubble from the outside. And this, I believe that this was the point of sort of high school, at least, or maybe even middle school. From the middle school, I think this somewhat becomes conspicuous, is that you kind of have a microcosm of culture, which is often very oppressive. Many people feel that they're not popular, they don't have some kind of social standing or social status. They are overshadowed by other things which garner popular appeal, and you feel often oppressed by those norms and by those conventions that operate within that microcosm of a culture, and that also lets you get a handle on it, and it also lets you get to cope with it or to tolerate with it, or to work out how perhaps you can try to game the system, or how you can try to carve out a niche for yourself, or how you can sort of, because when you're dealing with young people, you can't expect perfect moral behavior and perfect moral interpretation and understanding of what's going on. It's going to, you're going to expect juvenile models of microcosms of things like culture to be something like the worst versions of themselves, but that also is like a breeding grounds of education. Um, you know, uh, you, the blacksmith requires quite a hot, high temperature crucible in order to craft something out of sort of the potential of malleability. So people are only going to find their forms in an environment in which there is a lot of pressure to some degree. Um, anyway, yeah, there's so many issues here, but essentially, what I'm basically saying is that middle school and high school should perhaps generally be quite toxic to the degree to which that individuals learn how to rebel against the collective. They learn how to manage their own internal view and regard of things. They learn how to develop a boundary between the external narrative and the external locus of control and an internal locus of control. And often the internal locus of control is certainly outnumbered, and is certainly, there's a differential in power, but there's a different kind of power between the internal and the external. And cultivating that is an important general psychological thing that has to happen. Now, it seems to me that Generation Z or Z is never going to have properly done this at all. And by the way, it is also possible to develop an internal locus of control and to develop a friendship with other people's internal locus of control. And a lot of the ways in which one can try to sort of mediate that is, in some sense, through the sharing of cultural politics, which is essentially what the medium of humor is. Humor is an expression of a kind of cultural commentary to some degree. I mean, it can contain themes of such. I would argue that there's always a kind of political, cultural theme, the cultural political, the politics of culture is thematically embedded into people's sense of humor. But it seems that Generation Z essentially does not have an individuated or individualized sense of humor. Um, and I think that this means that they don't even have the material around which that you would render an individual, in which you would form an internal locus of control. They don't have the markers that could start to be used to make the boundary lines, because it's not just having a clear boundary, is that you need to have a way to let people in. You need to have a way to have friendship of the internal locus of control with somebody else's internal locus of control. So you need to have something like political cultural commentary, i.e. humor, to work out if somebody else is congruent with you or has similar alignment between the internal locus of control. I mean, this is also why humor is often one of the precursors in courtship or whatever, is that people experience each other's sense of humor and they appreciate each other's sense of humor, because in some sense it is a public form of a private judgment, or it is a public expression of, or because it's not, it's both, you have to decipher it quite a bit in order to work out what's really behind humor. Sometimes it's not always obvious. It's, there are sometimes many layers and many, and you don't know to what level it was fully intended until you have the recurring sense of somebody's humorous style, and it's interesting because you could argue that sort of, I mean, famously, women have been contrasted against men as not being as funny. That's a sort of an age-old feminist sort of argument or general controversy around comedy. And the difference between female humor and male humor, if there is one, and or at least that there are fewer comedic females than there are comedic males. And I wonder if this is not because, again, back to my hypergamous point, is that humor requires some kind of actual understanding. It requires a kind of self-consistency and coherence, and in some sense it requires you to stand back from the narrative and to judge the narrative and to contain the narrative within your internal locus of control, and then to pitch an idea based on that. And humor also being the kind of medium that it is, it could be seen as propaganda, or because in some sense, what I mean is that humor is not, it's not only useful for an internal locus of control. It maybe could be appreciated for other reasons that aren't, let's say, private or personal or genuine or have to do with self-consistency, that they just, it just seems clever for some technical reason, or, and so, humor can also have hollow, sort of maybe superficial, sort of purchase attached to it. I mean, obviously, the Generation Z worth value quality of humor is sort of is an exemplification of this point. Is that humor can be vacuous and just a kind of, in some sense, a kind of virtue signal to some degree of conformity or of compliance. To some narrative, perhaps. I mean, this perhaps isn't specific about humor. This is just in general about sentiment, that people can fake sentiment, or at least can produce the sentiment that a kind of narrative script um, is expected or extracted. But I mean, this is why always sort of the identitarians and sort of the social deconstructivists are, in my view, quite malevolent and resentful and evil people at the end of the day, because it's sort of, they always pretend that people are just sort of machines that are run on the programming of the social conventions and the social norms, and there's no way to break the scripts and there's no way to break the narrative, and the only people that think that they can are the ones who have the unearned privilege, and that's really a symptom of the problem. It's sort of it's a kind of fundamental death cult of a kind of libertarian defeatism, so that they can sort of continue with their grievance mongering and proselytizing and promotion. That there's only one thing to be concerned with, and there's essentially only one program of solution to it. They need those things to be intact, otherwise they don't get any movement on the tracks that they are only on the only tracks that they are capable of sort of monitoring and tracking and keeping in mind and peering at reality through the lens thereof. But so it really is like a cult, like a kind of death cult, but of sort of the living dead. I mean, I would also describe them as kind of psychologically as being a kind of living dead. Or at least spiritually, rather. But my point is that that when sentiment is faked, when sentiment becomes sort of scripted, you have obviously denigrated the boundary of the individual. You have obviously denigrated the sanctity of the individual. You have culturally normalized the dehumanization of authentic self-consistency and coherence. And you can see how I think that is what is being policed in the norms of humor. Because if someone has their own brand of humor, if someone says, no, that's not funny, if they are the nail that sticks out and say, no, that's not funny, then what they are is they are Neo in the Matrix, that someone trying to be unplugged from the Matrix. And so Agent Smith must quickly come in and take them out and suppress them, or put in a tracking device, or inject them with so that's just, I think that the sort of the humor in Generation Z is somewhat one of the systems of control, and yeah, you really have to just kind of watch the Matrix movie and take the red pill when you're in middle school. And if you don't do that, then you're condemned to being a superficial, vacuous, virtue signaling sort of zealot, um, as we see, with these very vacuous feminist politicians, or these activists, and their very ostentatious, superficial, and sort of arrogance and pretentiousness, and sort of all their terrible ideas and their self righteousness and moral grandstanding, and always sort of. And it's interesting because I mean, I was somewhat thinking about this because there was a local news story, about a woman in high school. Sorry, about a woman at university who has joined. She's a white woman with blonde hair, I think, and she was complaining that people are calling her a race traitor because she joined, in the student politics at the university. She is a member of the Economic Freedom Fighters, which sort of, they have these red berets, and they are basically black fascists. They are the party of black fascism, essentially. Um, and I don't believe that a lot of people called her a race traitor, because I really think that for her to complain that she's being called a race traitor is not a complaint. That's an ideological merit in her racial consciousness and worldview. So she's almost to complain that she's being called a race traitor is, in some sense, to endorse her own beliefs. I mean, I really think a lot of these things that occur are essentially false flag events. What they do is these activists, these people, they will actually make fake accounts to ply racial abuse or racist insults against themselves, because that is how you gain currency in their worldview. Is that the narrative only works if you frame yourself as the victim of, essentially, a kind of a racial agenda. I mean, the whole thing is built on a kind of conspiracy. I made a really long post. I thought it was quite a well-written post, where I said, well, there were even Jews in Nazi Germany who fell for and believed the Nazi propaganda. So it does. I wouldn't call this person a race traitor. I would just call them, a kind of a proto-fascist, racial, sort of identitarian, um, that has the same kind of racial consciousness as the people that designed apartheid, who also, try to put a moral veneer on their divide and rule strategy, because, the apartheid is where we get the phrase separate but equal development, which is exactly the kind of model which is proposed by people like the EFF, where you have to have the separate racial pride that needs to be brought into equilibrium. Um, and then you've got the way of, because then you can create a narrative around a kind of social psychology, and so you don't. So even when your policy fails, you can just say no, but we're doing it because we have to repair the social psychology. It always becomes sort of esoteric. And sorry, the other parallel here is this is something that I say a lot, but it's just somewhat relevant to this point, is that the conspiracy of white privilege is qualitatively exactly the same as the conspiracy, that the Nazis had, about the Jewish conspiracy against the Aryan people. It's the same thing, and it's anyway. But I would say that, in terms of the culture war, in terms of how this affects people's psychology on an individual level, all of this political ideological stuff happens down the chain, down the value chain, but how it's somewhat made room for, and how it's structurally policed and enforced to some degree, is that humor is being controlled like this. And I would just recommend to Generation Z to rebel against their vacuous standards of humor, and to develop your own sense of humor, develop your own inclination, as it were. I mean, I think that maybe, I mean, I don't have statistics of all of this, but I mean, I get the reading that generation. I mean, like, what shows do Generation Z appreciate? And I know, I imagine that the only one in my mind, maybe I'm completely wrong about this as well, is maybe something like Rick and Morty, because Rick and Morty seems to almost be dealing with a kind of existential nihilism. You know, Rick is a kind of is dealing with kind of existential issues, and that show does have a kind of a deep existential thematic thread within it. Um, so you can almost get a kind of humor within the context of some kind of deep philosophy around, at least the around some deep issues that are connected with setting up an internal locus of control. Um, and so is somewhat kind of exploring some issues around that. Um, but it is interesting because, you know, sort of, I would argue that this is why media itself has taken such a huge knock within our culture. You know, we used to have really good plots and narratives and stories, and now we have very shit plots and narratives and stories because they are there's no appreciation of actual sort of individual. I was watching by the Critical Drinker made a very, I think it was like an 18-minute video called "Why Modern Media Sucks." I'll try find it and put it in the links or whatever. I think I've got the name slightly wrong. And you know, he was just basically going through the mechanics of set up and payoff. That you need to set up a story and then it has to pay off, and you have to kind of set it up in a way where you're kind of doing a bit of a magic trick, where you kind of you where it's not obvious to the audience what is being set up, so that when it pays off, um, it's a revelation of something, and it also, because it's a revelation, um, you are actually solving a mystery, an existential mystery, some kind of mystery on some level is being exemplified to you. And I mean, this has always been the magic of media, is essentially is the inclination towards um, exploring mysteries and or essentially revelation, um, the revelation of some truth, or at least of some obstacle that gets in the way of truth, fundamentally. And all of that, you just see the dearth of that within Generation Z. There is no even capability of or sensibility that this is even available, because they don't even have the boundaries of having an individualism around which to navigate or around which to seek these sorts of things. You know, they are just kind of, they are perforated in their um, anyway. So they really need to repair themselves. They really need to remedy the perforation. They need to set up some boundaries. Again, those boundaries, some of them need to be hard, but then they also need to be overlapped with with a kind of sense of humor, because those are the gates that make the boundaries, a permeable membrane. You can't just have a cordoned off membrane. You need, you know, you need to have some ability to sort of reach out and connect with other people, and that is is a few things. I mean, obviously you need to be able to put people to terms and to say, no, 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 I'm not having this. This is abusive. I'm walking away from you. You know, like, I'm putting my boundaries up against this kind of abuse. But you also need to have, let's say, the nuance of a sense of humor, so that you can kind of, so that you can also, because in some sense that's also what people are doing through their humor, is that they have a, their sense of humor is their antennae of what mysteries it is that they are invested into solving, or what they are committed to, or what they have already, their humor is somewhat a stylistic projection in some sense, their existential sexuality, in some sense, as in to use the metaphor that sexuality is kind of like a diplomatic politics that one has to navigate in one's life. And obviously there are you can have humor and you can have sexuality somewhat combined within a particular style. Um, the mystique of sex, the mystique of humor, the mystique of any topic can somewhat also be mimicked or replicated with any other topic potentially, depending on one's sensibility of one what depending on what one finds appropriate, or but also that is also negotiation within culture, because one doesn't just impose one's unilateral individuation. One also does compromise on the level of and how one negotiates that compromise as well, and the measures that one uses in order to make that that discerning. When do you concede to the group so as to not, but then how do you hold your private contentions to be prosecuted another day, or to be so there's an administration, there's a managerial and so anyway, life is not simple, as it were, and at the end of the day, there's an oversimplification which Generation Z has fallen victim to, essentially, and they need to wrestle with that oversimplification, and they need to unplug themselves from it. Otherwise, essentially, they are always going to sort of be, I would argue, psychologically broken, as it were. Or dependent on sort of some kind of main line of some kind of orthodoxy or narrative that is telling them how to regiment their own sensibility, which is, I would argue, quite that's not having a permeable membrane. That's sort of being tethered up into the cloud and being given commands. That is literally being plugged into the matrix and turning and being an agent yourself. I would argue that all of these people, they don't have their own sense of humor, or essentially, or at least have this bastardized lowest common denominator sense of humor, are these people who become agents, at any second, because they have no appreciation of the peculiar individual, of the discerning individual. They will automatically override such a thing as being fundamentally of no value, because it doesn't hold currency within their narrative matrix, as it were, because they don't have a construction of their own, let's say, personal matrix of value and significance and importance. And in some sense, if you don't give yourself the bubble of humor in order that's actually what humor used to mean. Humor is like the stuff of life. This is, the medieval European medicine sort of theory, that, the alchemical sort of European theory of medicine was all about, bile and humor, all these different biles and all these different humors that you have inside of yourself. Anyway. Humor, the stuff of life, the container of life, or the sustainer of one's. Anyway, there's no reason to sort of to be overly invested into words, but this is just one way of okay. This is an addendum. I just wanted to go back and clean up the one claim that I made that I didn't properly substantiate, which was essentially how the Generation Z sort of cultural hegemon was this kind of was modeled as a kind of the whole sort of authoritarian, identitarian sort of moral grandstanding and stuff like that, how that is essentially hypergamous in the same way that there was always kind of corruption in politics, sort of creating a kind of virtue signaling around kind of issues that then. So how I reduce that all into being a kind of hypergamous sort of thing is that is to say that one of the effects of hypergamy, or at least the hypergamous sexual strategy, is that you don't have to understand things. You just have to reduce them to a narrative in which you can read the tokens. You can read the tokenism. You can there's some kind of symbolism as what is taken to be of high standing or high status, and the thing is that why I call this the current cultural hegemon, or why that the current culture is being run in this mode, is because essentially as soon as you start having a kind of mechanism of cultural enforcement according to this mode, what you do is you end up cracking down on people that develop their own independent understanding, their own, which is archetypally regarded as masculine order, because if one person understands something, then they are capable of being an independent node of integrity and they can criticize the system. But if you end up with a kind of ideological police structure where you say, no, 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 you are the nail that sticks out, you're not conforming, your understanding does not fit the narrative, we're going to eject you, then you've got essentially then you've got the hypergamous cultural hegemon in place. Because you've got this kind of narrative orthodoxy which is being enforced, and it wants to be able to rely on its symbols. It wants to be able to rely on its tokenism, and the commitment to that ideological tokenism or symbolism. And in some sense, this is where the moral consideration vests from the narrative and not in the individual. So the individual has no ammunition, has no fundamental way to safeguard their own understanding, their own private liberty, as it were. They are expected to sort of be fundamentally prone to being policed by the narrative, as it were. And I was just sort of explaining how this doesn't just happen in a political vacuum. This happens in a culture, and in some sense I think that the humour of Generation Z is a perfect example about how this cultural schema has been deployed, and how it how it undermines the individual psychological schema, how it makes very mentally disturbed people, how it makes very fundamentally prone people that are subject to the narrative and subject to being in concordance with the narrative. Anyway, and so I think that the subject of Generation Z's humor is in some sense the perfect sort of psychosocial subject to see where the toxicity of ideology and the toxicity of culture has given way to what is, as far as I can tell, a very sort of authoritarian mode of culture. It's in some sense one can, I think, make correct parallels between this and the glass heart of China, as it's called. And in some sense, there is a kind of Russian version of this, although the Russian version is, in some sense, always justified by a kind of cynical realpolitik, in some sense. The Russian version of this has a rationalization which has to remain true for it to be in effect. So in some sense, politically in Russia, this mentality is much more hedged on a kind of real political calculation. In some sense, and the oligarchs in Russia have been very good at playing this line of this real politics, that the world is against us. We have to be nationalistic in order to have a collective resilience against the evil outgroup, which wants our so you have a kind of external you have an external source that you can divert blame onto, and say that no, no, well, we just have to cope with these conditions. These are environmental conditions, and we are just trying our best to sort of under the weight of these problems which are external to us. And so the oligarchs get a free ride on this moral grandstanding, on this great grand moral narrative. And this is the formula of corruption. This is the formula of unaccountable governance and irresponsible leadership. Is you basically you conduct a kind of false flag, never-ending conflagration where you can always just ramp up the moral grandstanding in that, let's say, overly rationalized, sort of self-perpetuating rationalization. Now, the social justice identity politics formulation is a lot more convoluted, and I have given detailed breakdowns of it, but it works as a kind of dilemma where they've got two arguments working simultaneously, and they kind of switch between those two arguments. So if you try to defeat one of those arguments, the other argument gets you because they're being advanced on you simultaneously. And it doesn't matter that this is intellectually dishonest and unfair because they don't care about fairness. They've got good propaganda against, how fairness is sort of part of white privilege and reasonableness is part of white privilege, and so if you don't already agree with them, then you deserve to sort of be gulagged or, Auschwitzed, is basically their whole conspiracy theory. That's how it operates. And so you don't have time to defeat their worldview in some sense because they get to be the chairman of time. They get to sort of completely set the narrative up before you can set up a counter narrative. And so they've got all of these triggers and all of these it's they've in some sense got their own. People complain about traditional values, and in some sense this is the kind of the age old traditional value uh, of just wanting an oversimplified moral reduction that is a shorthand so that you can sort of use a social convention or leverage a kind of symbol or token of some moral impetus, and then you can sort of position yourself. You can socially manipulate based on the politics of those of that appearance, of the appearance of that token, of that condition. And so you can always just reference these things and you can create convenient rationalizations. And it doesn't matter that there's no understanding behind any of this. You can just kind of narrate yourself around any problem as long as you can sort of cast what's happening to you as being sort of the part of the sacred narrative that is morally enshrined in the social tokenism or convention. So you just have to say, I mean, so I mean, these things can be modulated into different accusations and things like that, because there's nothing constraining it in what it might pertain to, but you could argue, sort of toxic masculinity, or he's a racist. It just becomes sort of like hollow ideological labels that don't even pertain to the person's own thinking. They pertain to the person's thinking reframed and recontextualized and decontextualized from the supremacy of the identitarian narrative and orthodoxy. So you're being constantly sort of gaslighted while your own moral character is being indicted for not already conforming to the sociological plan that the narrative entails. And so you kind of have a pragmatic, expedient, utilitarian moral argument to defeat, while your character is being impugned for not already being on board with that sociological plan. And so if you try to make ground that the sociological plan is corrupt, or that it's not going to lead to the so-called intended outcome, then they say, well, we should stop listening to you because you are obviously a racist, because look at what you're saying. You're denying the narrative, and only someone would only deny the narrative if their own character was that of a racist. So then the label applies, because you're defeating the narrative, because there's no alternative to their narrative. It's that sort of unilateral and sort of locked into its own subjective relativism, as if there's no other, form of humanism or sort of empathy or anything like that. That, empathy comes through identifying with the narrative and sympathizing with narrative objects, and vesting moral consideration in group identity is the only thing that you can care about. You can't care about actual individuals. You have to care about the individual valences of identity. And if you sort of break that paradigm, then you are trying to remove other people's validation from the social construct of identity. You're trying to stop the equilibrium of pride between the identities. And so, because they've kind of dishonestly, they're attacking you on two ends. They're making utilitarian moral arguments, consequentialist arguments, but then they're also attacking your character. And in some sense, that's also, if they didn't do that as well, then they wouldn't be such adherent believers in their own system, in their own ideological paradigm, because that's what gives them their sort of self-righteousness and their self-confidence, that because the kind of moral indictment that they would put on somebody else's character is the same kind of moral self-righteousness that they would bestow on themselves for being a partisan ideologue. And so it's a direct kind of parasitism. It's a direct kind of sort of living dead, that they are the zombie vampires that have to feed on the morality of the living. Without that kind of agitation and resistance to their ideology, which then they can reframe as being sort of sacred victims themselves, then there's sort of so in some sense the resistance that they feel is to be expected, and in some sense it is ideologically necessary. I mean, you can see this also with the Nazis. Even after the Nazis had locked up all of the Jews, there were no Jews in Nazi society. They were all locked up in gulags or being killed. So they had completely contained the so-called Jewish problem. But yet, the Jewish conspiracy theory was at its height, because they complained that the Jewish conspiracy was not that the Jews themselves had physically infiltrated the Aryan society, but that they had psychologically infiltrated the Aryan society, and that the Jews had essentially colonized the minds of the Aryans, and that the Jewish corruption was still in the psyche of the Aryan people. And this is also how they were able to keep control this is how the authoritarianism was able to perpetuate and to reframe every possible problem. So anything that came up, they could just say, well, it's because the Jewish conspiracy still haunts us. So they have a perfect scapegoat, they have a perfect diversion. And I would argue that the whole system doesn't even function if the scapegoat leaves. If you actually diminish the scapegoat to the point at which that it's no longer an ideological viable diversion, then I think then the fascism really is problematic, because then they'd have to turn on themselves. They'd have to sort of, and I do believe that they did plan to turn on themselves as well. I believe that the SS were going to be their own Übermensch, their own. I don't think any this kind of authoritarian structure with this kind of unaccountable leadership will always lead to a caste system, because you have to justify, let's say, the internal corruption, as it were. Because in some sense, I mean, the Nazis very clearly in the high command, they knew that they didn't believe their own propaganda, but they said that it was like a necessary means to an end, that we don't expect the people in the top echelons of the Nazi command to believe in the propaganda. That's just what we tell the plebs. But, the cream rises to the surface, and so it's like once you're deep in the cabal of the leadership, then obviously, yes, that's just that's just to keep the public order, that's just to keep people safe, so that they don't question their the sort of the royal inner sanctum. And so to me, this is a fundamental. This is what I think will be the downfall of China, and in some sense, ironically, it'll be what exactly Lenin was trying to avert with his preemptive revolution, but ironically, probably guaranteeing this kind of corruption. Because Lenin's whole idea was that capitalism would always organically generate an oligarchy that would take over society with its sophisticated tools before an organic Marxist revolution could take place. Therefore, Lenin said, don't try to have an organic Marxist revolution, try have a preemptive revolution. Revolt as soon as possible and have an artificial state capitalism, essentially, was Lenin's idea. But it remains to be seen, because, well, the only person the only country that could possibly try to make this formula work is potentially China, and I would argue that it's fundamentally too corrupt in order to do this. That although it might tell itself that this is the overarching agenda and plan, I think that there will always be a tendency towards justifying the kinds of unaccountable leadership, because essentially when you have leadership of an authoritarian state structure, you have to rationalize that to yourself at some level. And I do think that you end up resenting the people that you end up controlling, essentially, because you can't really say that you're leading them. I think you have to admit that you're controlling them. And that is a basic moral toxin or a moral poison, which only liberty-based political structures have any kind of hedge against. Now, obviously, you could argue that there are oligarchs in the West, the big industrial business, what do they call the military industrial complex, but just the industrial incumbent interest, sort of conglomeration of power in the West. But I would argue that this is because the law itself is not exact enough, is not principled enough, does not have enough structure in order to protect the individual. But anyway, those are other arguments that I've made in other videos. And that is an issue that can be remedied. Anyway.